Putting his latest Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. His website, Chris Ryan, ChrisRyan, PhD.com. And his Twitter handle is that Chris Ryan. Oh, yeah, that Chris Ryan. Hey, Chris, welcome to the program and congratulations on this book, Civilized to Death. I've bought at least a dozen copies so far. I think you did a great job of going down a path that I started down back in 1996 in my book, The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. About a third of the book is devoted to ancient civilizations or pre-civilizations and hunting, gathering, and all this kind of stuff. And you have taken it so much farther and done so much on it. It's just brilliant, and I wanted to thank you for that and get you on. So let's dig into it. You've got some great points, and I love your Civilized to Death cocktail party cheat sheet. So let me just run through some of this stuff. Thomas Hobbes told us famously when he published Leviathan back in, 1634, as I recall, that prior to the civilization, before humans had to deal with the iron fist of church or state, that the natural state of mankind, of humankind, was terrible, that there was, no arts, no letters, no communication, no transportation. Life was nasty, short, and brutish. What say you?
I say that Hobbes was wrong on every point. And, we don't necessarily need to blame him because he didn't have any archaeological or anthropological data to work with. So he was just sort of pulling these things out of the air. And Hobbes did what most of us do. He looked at the world that he knew and extrapolated from that. You and I, about 10 years ago, talked about a previous book that I co-authored called Sex at Dawn. Mm-hmm. And in that book, we called this tendency Flintstoneization, right? To sort of look at the world, and just make it older and call that prehistory. And that's what Hobbes was doing. He lived in an extremely violent, disease-ridden, conflict-ridden, insecure world, and he just assumed that it must have been even worse back in the day before the state was there to exert a bit of control over the situation.
So if it wasn't worse, what was it like?
Well, it turns out, Hobbes said famously that life before the state was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Before the advent of the state, let's look at solitary. It was much less solitary. Hunter-gatherers have a very intense sense of community and cooperation and mutual dependence. So certainly not solitary. Poor. Well, poverty is an invention of civilization. Poverty is a relative status where some people have much less than others. In hunter-gatherer societies, universally organized around egalitarianism and the sharing of resources. So in such a situation, there's no poverty because everyone has the same access to resources. Nasty, brutish, there's a lot of controversy about how violent societies were before the advent of agriculture. I think the evidence is quite strong that extreme violence, and certainly organized warfare is very much a result of agriculture and accumulated resources, where there's something worth fighting over. In nomadic, immediate return hunter-gathering societies, there's no wealth. There's nothing gathered and accumulated that's worth stealing or defending. And short, one of the great misunderstandings that people have about prehistoric life, and I hear this all the time, is we've doubled the human lifespan. People died at 35. No one lived past 35. I even hear this from medical doctors, and this is hogwash. This is totally misinformed. No human being has ever been old at the age of 35. Our species regularly lives into their 70s and 80s, even as hunter-gatherers. The misunderstanding came about, as you know, from
infant mortality.
Statistical.
Yeah.
What?
It's infant mortality that was driving those numbers.
Exactly. And infant mortality is quite high among hunter-gatherers. So when you do the math, you get an average lifespan life expectancy at birth of around 35 to 40, but that doesn't mean anyone was ever old at 35 or 40.
Right. One wonders if that's the natural state of humankind and infant mortality was relatively high, if that was one of the things that evolution, I mean, just taking humans and human intent out of this altogether and viewing us as just another animal, if that's one of the ways that evolution had prepared us to have a relatively stable population, compared to our potential for fertility. But you point out in the book that also hunting gathering people, mothers tend to nurse their babies for 2, 3, 4 years, and during that period of time, they're not fertile. They typically can't get pregnant. This, right. I remember reading, when I was reading Jefferson's diaries like 25 years ago, and he was, going on and on about how the Iroquois around him had babies every 5 to 7 years, and he was like, "How do they do that? How is that even possible?" And and he thought it was a marvelous thing. He thought it was a great, but he said he made a comment that women in Virginia were more like cows, basically, just constantly producing babies. Not the women themselves, but the situation. So modern medicine. Well, actually, I want to put this in a larger frame and then pull back from that for a moment. Neither you, in your book, Civilized to Death, or in me in my book, Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, are proposing that we just all of a sudden walk away from civilization and go live in the woods. What if we stop telling ourselves these myths about how horrible life was for humans before civilization, or how horrible life must be right now for humans who live, in the few remaining wild places in the world? If we stop telling ourselves those myths and start understanding these consequential and fundamental realities, and I think science is really bringing us there with things like, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, the Equality Trust in the UK, that the more unequal a society becomes, the more you see disease, teenage pregnancy, homicide, suicide, crime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's all, and it's not out of poverty, it's out of inequality, because it makes us crazy. So what are the things that you would suggest we learn from pre-agricultural people to bring into our post-agricultural society?
Well, that's a great question. I look at it as one of the images that I used in the book was visiting a zoo in Indonesia. That was a very sad, brutal place. It was just cages with primates trapped in these cages. And then years later, I visited the San Diego Zoo, which was a totally different experience. And the reason it's a different experience is that the San Diego Zoo is designed with an understanding of the animals that live there, where they come from, where they evolved, what food works best for them, what social system works best, how much space they need. And I think that that's what we need to do for ourselves. We're the only species that lives in zoos that we ourselves have designed. We've created our own conditions of captivity. And you're right, there's no way we're going back to a hunter-gatherer existence. So what we can do is we can create our artificial world with an understanding of the world that created us. And that will lead to much more meaningful, healthy lives. And you see it's happening already. It's an interesting thing in all these different fields. People are starting to understand that the way forward requires an understanding of our deep past. So in medicine, people are looking at what kind of diets did our ancestors eat? How much fiber? What about microbiome? How did they move? How often did they move? How vigorously did they move? You're seeing all sorts of areas with primal as a prefix, right? Because people are understanding that the primal blueprint actually really works well for our species. If you want to understand your dog's behavior, look at wolves, right? That's where your dog came from. So by understanding the behavior of wolves, you'll have insight into how to interact with your dog better.
Chris, one of the things that when I was doing research for Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, one of the things that really fascinated me was reading Peter Farb. Are you familiar with Peter Farb?
I don't think so, no.
He wrote two books in the 60s. One was called Humankind, which a Dutch writer has basically rewritten a brand new version of that is almost a clone of Farb's book, except it's completely up to date with all kinds of new research. I'm forgetting his name right now.
Rutger Bregman.
Thank you, yes. And it's a brilliant book, but if you go back and read Humankind, by Peter Farb, you get where, what he was doing with that book. But he also wrote a book called Man's Rise to Civilization and the Native American, which was astonishing. It's the story of, he compiled first contact stories of Native American communities around around North America. I think he looks at 34 of them, as I recall. It's been more than 20 years since I read the book, so I'm sorry, it's not right at the tip of my brain, all the details. But many of, if not most of the Native American societies, at least in the American South and parts of the American West, were highly agricultural at that point, as we are. They were settled. The communities, for example, there was a giant tribe that lived near what we would today call New Orleans, and they were pyramid builders. And so that society, in order to maintain social stability, had a caste system, much like the old Indian caste system. There were 4 castes. The top caste was the sun gods. They were the ancestors of the sun gods. There were 2 middle castes. I don't remember the names. And the bottom caste was the equivalent of the untouchables, and they were called the stinkards. And the requirement in their society was that you always had to marry somebody who was 2 castes away from you. So every family had in their own personal direct family sun gods, stinkers, and everybody else. And what it did was it created a social consensus for a high level of equality within the society, even though they had created these 4 castes largely for division of labor. Who's going to do what? But the stinkards weren't quite as oppressed as we see in India today. But that was just one example that just kind of blew my mind. The book is filled with them. Do you know of anybody who is, or have you considered proposing ways that we can reinvent American or modern human society in ways that promote egalitarianism? Or is it just, we all just start following Bernie Sanders? We have 30 seconds till we're going to boot into the next segment.
Yeah, we definitely have to all marry stinkers, I think. I've got a few in my family, for sure. Yeah, one of the things that I tried to do in Civilized to Death was talk about the question of inequality from a different angle. And the angle is that, we're always talking about the 1%ers and how unfair it is that they've accumulated all this wealth and resources. And it's true. I agree with that 100%. But the real irony is that they aren't happy either.
Right. Let's continue.
Inequality makes everyone miserable.
Just during the break, talking about how how Peter Farb was documenting how Native American societies that had become agricultural figured out internal cultural ways to have stability and egalitarianism. Jefferson wrote about the potlatch. He went to several of them where people would compete to see how much they could give away. The more you gave away at these annual events, the higher your status. And he also noted that hoarding of goods was considered a mental illness among the Iroquois. These were relatively modern post-agricultural societies. What can we learn from that? What can we do with our society? Is it just a matter of, we all do what the Norwegians and the Danish have done, that Bernie Sanders is recommending, or are there other things?
Well, we need to approach it systematically and also individually. So systematically, it's the sorts of stuff that you've been advocating for a long time, and Bernie Sanders, sort of a social democrat approach to life where resources are distributed much more equitably. But on a personal level, and I was referring to this before the break, I think that we need to sort of illuminate the fact that extreme wealth hurts everyone involved. Being extremely wealthy, sure, you've got gold-plated faucets in your bathroom, but you're very isolated. It's psychologically a very difficult position to be in because you lose the sense of community. And the one thing, you know, we're talking about diet and exercise patterns and all that, but the other sort of very important information that we learn when we study our ancestors is that the most important thing that we have to make us happy and to make our lives meaningful is a sense of community. If you feel embedded in a community of loving people, that's a more important factor in your health and longevity than your weight, whether you smoke or not, how much exercise you get. Any other factor you look at pales in comparison to whether you feel that you're part of a community of people who love you and have your back. When you're extremely wealthy, you sacrifice that. You don't have that kind of community because you're worried everyone's trying to take advantage of you. Everyone has an angle. They're trying to pitch you something. And ironically, when the money that we're all pursuing is corrosive to some of the most important things in life. So I think on a personal level, if we can understand that pursuing money is not actually going to solve your problems, it's going to create a lot of problems, and we can be much happier with much less, then it's not that radical a proposal. We're not trying to take away anyone's well-being. Everyone benefits in a more equitable society.
Yeah, I had a friend whose father invented Formica. He was born with a $700 million trust fund, and we knew him for 3 decades. And one day, just in a kind of random, he was showing me a print that he had just gotten by one of the Dutch masters that was worth millions. And he just all of a sudden started crying, and I was like, what's going on? And he was like, you and Louise are, I think, the only friends that I've had in years who've never asked me for anything. Who don't hit me up for donations, who don't see me as money bags, and it just broke my heart. I mean, this guy was a good friend, a very rich guy, but a good friend, and who I'd known for a long, long time. I just see there's so much pain in this world, and so much of it is being caused by greed. Chris, we're running out of time here. It's just why I'm kind of telling this story, but I think your book puts its finger, I think with this book you put your finger on some really critical values that we need to consider adopting as a society. And I strongly encourage everybody out there to get a copy of this extraordinary new book, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. Christopher Ryan, thanks so much for dropping by, Chris. Great talking.